Sylvester Stallone gave up his first-class seat to a veteran, but what happened next silenced the entire plane. Inside Los Angeles International Airport, people were bustling about, each preoccupied with his own journey. Among them, Sylvester Stallone walked in dark jeans, a casual jacket, and aviator sunglasses low on his nose. He didn't attract much attention, and he liked it that way. No cameras, no fans around, just a normal flight. At the boarding gate, Stallone handed his boarding pass to the flight attendant and walked into the first-class cabin. He sat down in seat 2A, stretching out comfortably before the flight began. But then, an image caught his eye. A tired-looking old man, probably in his 70s, slowly entering the plane. His hands shook slightly as he held onto the armrest for balance. The old canvas bag swung at his side. His worn shoes showed the long journey he had traveled. On his head was a hat with the words Vietnam War Veteran. A flight attendant walked over and asked kindly, "Sir, can I help you?" The veteran shook his head slightly, his voice hoarse with the marks of time. "Thank you, I'm fine." Some of the passengers in the first-class cabin glanced furtively. Some pretended not to see. But Stallone was different. He carefully observed the man's every heavy step. The bag seemed heavier than he could carry. Without hesitation, Stallone unbuckled his seatbelt, stood up, and turned to the flight attendant. "Let him sit in my seat." The first-class cabin became silent. The whispers stopped. The tapping of keyboards and turning of pages also stopped. All eyes were on Stallone and the veteran. The old man stopped, looking at Stallone with astonishment. "Son, I've been in conditions worse than economy class. I'm fine with my seat." Stallone stepped forward, his voice soft but firm. "I serve this country. This little thing is the least you can do." The veteran blinked, his wrinkled hands unconsciously tightening the straps of his bag. He looked around, as if waiting for someone to object, but everyone just watched in silence. A flight attendant said softly, "Sir, if you agree, we'll help you pack your bags." The veteran let out a soft sigh. Pride fought with fatigue. He could feel the pain in his legs, the stiffness in his back after so many years. After a moment of silence, he looked at Stallone, then down at the luxurious chair. "Are you sure?" he asked. Stallone smiled. "I insist." Slowly, carefully, the veteran set down his bag and eased himself into his seat. Once settled, his shoulders slumped as if he didn't realize how tired he was. A round of applause rang out in the cabin. Some passengers clapped politely, while others were more enthusiastic. The flight attendant smiled warmly, carefully adjusting his seatbelt. The veteran glanced at Stallone, his voice softer, almost hesitant. "Thank you." Stallone nodded, holding out his hand. The two men shook hands firmly, without another word. He turned to walk toward the back of the plane, but before he could take a step, a man from a few rows behind suddenly stood up. His face was ashen, his eyes staring blankly at the veteran as if he had seen a ghost. The moment hung in the air, heavy with something unsaid. The man, who looked middle-aged, dressed in a button-down shirt and slacks, gripped the chair in front of him, his knuckles white. His breathing was rapid, his lips parted, but no words came out. The veteran frowned. "Are you okay?" The silence stretched between them. Then the man swallowed, stepping forward slowly. "My father, after all, he was in your unit." The veteran's face changed, his expression hard to read. He tilted his head slightly, studying the man. "Your father?" The man nodded, his throat tight. "Daniel Harrington." The veteran's eyes widened. It was only for a moment, but Stallone caught it. The pain he had buried for so long flashed across the old man's face. His mouth opened slightly, but for a moment, no words came out. He gripped the armrest as if suddenly needing support. "Danny Harrington," the veteran muttered, his voice so low it was almost a whisper. "I'll be damned." The middle-aged man exhaled, his voice trembling. "You knew my father?" The veteran nodded slightly, his eyes distant. "Yes. Your father saved my life." His calloused fingers tapped against his knee as he stared past the man, past the plane, past everything. His mind was elsewhere. "Danny," he chuckled, "fearless fool?" A wave of tension in the air slowly dissipated. Frank shook his head, his gaze locked on the past, on the memory of a time of fighting. He used to say the worst thing about war wasn't the bombs. It was the silence the moment before it all began. Frank's calloused fingers gently tapped his knee, each tap a beat of time in a tense moment. He sat there, his eyes on the horizon through the plane's window, but his mind seemed to be lost in a distant place, a place of only memories and private thoughts. Beside him, Danny, with a small smile, a voice full of mischief, tried to dispel the heavy atmosphere. The soft breathing of the passengers was an affirmation that, despite the threat of war, there was still hope and life. A wave of tension, however fragile, gradually dissipated over time. Frank, with his sharp, silent eyes, seemed to be listening to something that only he could feel. He often said that the most devastating thing in war was not the gunfire or the rain of bullets, but the silence. The moment before the storm, when everything seemed to stop breathing, signaling something less than pleasant to expect. It had been almost a year since they had gone into battle together, and Frank had always been the one his comrades could count on, the one who led them home even when all hope seemed lost. He never let his fear show in his words, but his eyes, like windows to his soul, still betrayed a deep turmoil. Not long after, when the atmosphere seemed to have become calm, a sudden explosion tore through the silence. Danny felt it clearly as his body lost its balance, thrown to the ground by the explosion. In that chaotic moment, Danny did not hesitate. He rushed forward, pulling his companion away from the danger zone, even though he himself was caught in a nightmare. In the chaos, Frank still clung to an old photograph, where memories of the past surged up with the trembling of his hands. Every drop of sweat, every breath contained nostalgia and determination. As the gunshots rang out again, Frank's voice became hoarse for the first time, like a fateful curse but also a reminder of the necessity of comradeship. "Hold on, Danny." In the cramped space of the plane, time seemed to stand still. No one dared to move. No one dared to break that heavy silence, a silence in which each person carried the pain of a lifetime of fighting. The soldiers' shoulders seemed to carry not only weapons, but also wordless feelings, as if they were embracing the sadness of the world. In the midst of that chaos, Frank suddenly remembered the story that he, a veteran soldier, had told right before boarding the plane that day. He told about his wife, about the joy of being a father, about simple but meaningful dreams. Although they had never met, that story was like a warm fire, the reason why he fought fiercely in the midst of a fierce war. And in that moment, amid the gunfire and explosions, a tear silently fell down Frank's hard face. He smiled softly, as if he was shedding the burden of the past, muttering to himself things that only someone who had spent 50 years fighting could understand. The war was not just a battle of bullets and bombs, but also a battle of the soul, where silence, memory, and humanity blended together, creating the strength to overcome unimaginable challenges. Over the past 50 years, I have studied this man, and now, on this plane, I see him shaking his head, his voice filled with disbelief. Frank watches him with a knowing gaze, recognizing the irony of fate in a sarcastic way as silence falls over the passenger cabin. Those who had started the flight, engrossed in their phones, suddenly glue their eyes to their seats, as if waiting for a rare moment that may never come again. Just as the weight of the moment seems to be overwhelming, Stallone suddenly says, "Your dad is a real-life Rocky." That makes Frank chuckle, wiping away the tears on his cheeks. Despite his toughness, his trembling smile and slight nod show his emotion, still clutching the photo to his chest. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing that the plane would begin its descent. However, no one was really thinking about landing, as the engines had almost died. The atmosphere in the cabin suddenly shifted, carrying with it a sense of something beyond what had just happened. Passengers sat motionless, phones and magazines forgotten, while the flight attendants, accustomed to checking seat belts and serving drinks, listened quietly to something deeply human. Frank Delaney sighed, feeling the weight of the past lighten on his shoulders as he stared at the man before him, the son of his best friend, who had been left behind. There was so much he wanted to say, but words couldn't quite muster, so he simply reached into his duffel bag once more. The man watched silently, not knowing what would happen next, as Frank pulled out an old notebook, its cover scratched and its pages yellowed with age. He carefully lifted it up, his fingers shaking as he turned to a page in the middle. On the page, printed in faded ink, Frank read, "I've had it since the war." He said he wrote it down quietly during sleepless nights. Next were letters that had never been sent, with the names of people he never wanted to forget. He tapped the page lightly with his fingertips, as if to emphasize, "Your father is here." The man's breath caught. Frank quickly turned the notebook toward himself, realizing the faded ink made the words hard to read. But the name Daniel Harrington was scrawled in neat letters, followed by a small note underneath. The man squinted as he read the words, and his lips parted slightly as he read aloud, his voice trembling. "If I don't come home, tell my son I fought for him." At that moment, the air inside the plane seemed to move again, carrying a deep and shy feeling, as if memories and unspoken feelings were filling the cabin. In the space between them, the man smiled shakily, his hand involuntarily covering his mouth as his emotions surged. He turned to Stallone, shaking his head in disbelief, exclaiming, "This is crazy!" Meanwhile, Stallone watched silently, arms crossed and a small, knowing smile on his face. "I don't think this is crazy at all," the man said, quickly wiping away a tear and sniffling. He gestured to the old notebook beside him. After only a moment's hesitation, Frank nodded, replying, "It's yours now." The man's eyes widened as his trembling fingers hovered over the pages, which had faded with age. "Are you sure, Frank?" He chuckled, his voice tinged with mischief. "I've had it for 50 years. It's time it came home." Gently, the man hugged the notebook to his chest and whispered, "Thank you." Frank just nodded, every word becoming redundant in that solemn moment. Suddenly, without warning, a clap rang out from a corner of the cabin. At first, it was just a few hesitant claps, then gradually more claps followed, until the whole first-class cabin exploded in raw, sincere applause. Not the polite kind, but the applause of the soul. The applause was not just a tribute to a soldier who never came home, or to a son he never knew, but also the gratitude of veterans who always carried his memory. Frank glanced around, his lips curling into a small, shy smile, as if not quite worthy of the emotional uproar, all for an old man. He muttered under his breath as Stallone grinned, leaned slightly to the side and whispered, "I think you deserve it." The plane shook slightly as the landing gear was lowered, and the pilot's voice came over the intercom. "We have landed for the last time in Phoenix, Arizona." That moment was etched in the minds of every passenger, an unforgettable one. The wheels screeched softly on the runway, and from 1605, everyone sat silently, their eyes seemingly still following the image of the past. No one rushed to get their luggage. No one stood up. Everyone was lost in thought. The intercom rang. "Welcome to Phoenix, Arizona. Local time 4:17 p.m." Although the passengers began to move, the weight of the moment was still there, hanging in the air. Frank sighed, gently rubbing his hands on his knees as if to shake off old memories. The man, the son of his dead brother, still clung to the old notebook, like a lifeline connecting the past and the present. Stallone adjusted his jacket, turned to Frank. "Is anyone coming to pick you up, Frank?" Frank chuckled, shook his head and replied, "No, son. My legs are still working. The rental car is ready and waiting outside." Everything seemed to have returned to itself, but that memory, the old notebook and the moments of sharing, would forever be imprinted in everyone's heart. The man sitting next to Frank frowned and asked, "You live in Phoenix?" Frank hesitated for a moment, mumbling, "Tucson?" Meanwhile, Frank held his old notebook tightly, listening to every word, trying to find the right words. After a moment of silence, he just shook his head with a small smile, as if everything had been answered. Not knowing what else to say, Frank gently patted the other person's arm, his voice soothing and reassuring. "Now you don't have to say anything." At that moment, the seatbelt sign turned off, and the familiar chaos of landing suddenly exploded. Passengers rushed to the luggage compartment, muttering about connecting flights and getting their belongings. But not today. Not on this flight. Some people moved more slowly. A few passengers nodded respectfully to Frank as they passed by. A woman in business attire gently touched his shoulder before leaving, and a flight attendant thanked him softly for his service, her voice tinged with genuine emotion. As Stallone began to pack his things, Frank turned to look at him one last time. "Mr. Stallone," Stallone looked up, placed a hand on his carry-on, and said, "Yeah." Frank's gaze was still tender, following Stallone's every move, expressing his appreciation not only through his words, but also through the gentleness in his eyes. Frank sighed, then held out his hand. Stallone squeezed his hand, and they exchanged a firm handshake, the strength of people who had endured unforgettable moments together. The veteran's voice fell softly to a whisper. "I think I got a better deal." Stallone smiled, but there was something deep in his eyes as he watched Frank and the man, the son of his dead friend, walk toward the terminal. He stood there silently contemplating. Greatness is not measured in fame or fortune, but in simple moments like this. As Stallone stepped off the plane, he knew this would be a flight he would never forget. Sometimes a small gesture, a seat, or even a simple conversation can open up something much bigger than we ever expected. This story is not just about Sylvester Stallone or a veteran, but about all of us, about how we treat each other, about life-changing opportunities, and about unexpected moments that we never expected. You never know when a small decision or act of generosity can create a chain of events that someone has been waiting for their whole life. So next time you have an opportunity to do something good, take advantage of it because you never know whose story you might be walking into. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with those who need to hear it. Because sometimes simple stories have the power to change lives. I love it and wish you and your family all the best.